Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
I think I'm gonna make it, in spite of everything.
Right.
Good to see you. Good morning.
How are you? Good. You doing okay?
Good, doing good.
Good.
I didn't get a hug from you either.
No, because you had a whole hurry.
Good to see you.
And you had to come over with the agency.
Ma'am,
And here's where you had free meal today.
ma'am.
You want that free meal today?
Oh, yeah, I gotta have that.
I love you. I'm trying to send this new little family a gift card where I don't have to drive all the way out there with food.
Where's that at?
Doug and Micah had their baby.
Oh, okay. That was the first time you and I went out there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, where's that there, has it? Is it too much rain?
I understand that.
You don't have enough, or you have too much.
We've been dry for so long. Yeah.
We had people calling us last night asking us if we were okay. We knew it rained, but we didn't know it flooded like it did.
Talking to Quimby yesterday,
Yeah,
and, he said that he got 6 inches of rain.
yeah, that's what he talked about. He said he got inches of rain. I don't know if he told us 6.
We only got like 2 inches.
It rained in Lumberton, but it wasn't that bad. I mean, in Barnes, but it wasn't that bad.
So there's one. All right. I will, get us started. We are in Psalm 76. I'm correct on that.
Correct, you are.
Uh-huh.
All right. That is where we will begin, Psalm 76. In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion. There he broke the flashing arrows, the shield, the sword, and the weapons of war. Glorious are you, more majestic than the everlasting mountains. The stout-hearted were stripped of their spoil. They sank into sleep. None of the troops was able to lift a hand. At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both rider and horse lay stunned. But you indeed are awesome. Who can stand before you when once your anger is roused? From the heavens you uttered judgment. The earth feared and was still. When God rose up to establish judgment, to save all the oppressed of the earth. Human wrath serves only to praise you when you bind the last bit of your wrath around you. Make vows to the Lord your God and perform them. Let all who are around him bring gifts to the one who is awesome, who cuts off the spirits of princes, who inspires fear in the kings of the earth. Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we study your word. It is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. Okay, so we are in Genesis. We are entering into Genesis chapter 9. We finished up Genesis 8 last week. If you remember, the purpose of this study is actually only to go through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is sometimes referred to as the primordial or primeval history before God's call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 11. I'm hoping at some point we'll work our way back to Genesis and talk about Abraham, and then probably get through Abraham and some of his sons, and then return back to Genesis for the very end of it. The reason is because Genesis is 50 chapters, and it will take us a long time to work straight through Genesis, and I'm assuming all of you, myself included, would at some point get tired of Genesis, and so we're going to break Genesis up a little bit. I think the next thing that we'll do, once we get through Genesis chapter 11, I think we're going to move on and move to the New Testament and do the Gospel of Mark, the shortest Gospel, only 16 chapters, quite a bit shorter than Matthew, Luke, and John. We're doing a Gospel partly because I like going back and forth Old Testament, New Testament in our studies, which is kind of what we've been doing. But for selfish reasons, we're doing the Gospel of Mark because I love the Gospels. My scholarly study and PhD work is in the Gospels, and I'm getting ready to do some stuff on the Gospel of Mark for my podcast. So we're going to bring all of that together, and I'm going to double dip in a lot of different things that I'm involved in, and we're going to do the Gospel of Mark, which is a phenomenal, they're all phenomenal Gospels. Mark is probably my second favorite Gospel. Luke is obviously my favorite, but John is moving up there. Not that this matters, but because I just read a book that makes a compelling argument that John writes his gospel to an audience that he assumes is familiar with the Gospel of Mark. So reading Mark and John next to each other in a kind of historical type of way has been part of the fun that I do in my free time lately. Anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about this morning. This morning we are going to move in to Genesis chapter 9. Before we do so, a bit of recap where chapter 8 ended, where our discussion last week ended. The first 19 verses of chapter 8 is the conclusion of the watery part of the flood. The waters subside, the ark comes to rest on top of the mountains of Ararat. Noah and his family and all of the animals exit the ark. And that gets us to verse 20 of chapter 8, where God makes a promise that he's actually going to do two things. He says that he will never curse the ground again because of humankind, which takes us back to Genesis chapter 3 and the curses on the ground because of Adam and Eve eating of the tree. Remember the curse that God mentions to Adam is that the ground will be cursed because of you. It will bring forth thorns and thistles. Your working the ground for food will become more difficult. And then he says that he will never again destroy every living creature as I have done, which is a reference back to the flood of what has just happened. So God says there's two things that he's going to do after everything that's happened with the flood. He's not going to curse the ground. He's not going to flood the earth. And the reason is because he says the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. And we spent a lot of the time talking about how that is a very deep insight into our human nature. We can spend a lot more time talking about human nature. But the point is that God is saying he's changing gears. So Adam and Eve eat from the tree. He responds with the curses, and that doesn't accomplish a whole lot, right? Because it's only a few chapters later that the earth has become so wicked that God decides to flood everything, kill every living creature. After the flood, God starts again with Noah, and we're going to see in chapter 9 that process of starting again with Noah, but that doesn't last very long. I think this statement at the end of chapter 8 is a little bit of a foreshadowing of the story that we get at the end of chapter 9 with Noah and his vineyard and his sons. So God starts again with this family. It doesn't last very long, and then you have what can only be described as an abomination at the end of chapter 9. And then we get another genealogy in chapter 10, and then chapter 11, the last story before Abraham, is the story of the Tower of Babel. And so things don't go all that well after the flood. And so what God is saying is that he is changing gears because of the inclination of the human heart from youth, from our youngest age, to kind of be pulled to or bent to what is sinful, what is evil, things that are contrary to God. And so God is in essence saying, doing things like cursing the ground and flooding the earth may provide some kind of a temporary positive change, but it's not lasting. And that's kind of the story of all of Genesis 1 through 11, is to illustrate for us really who we are as human beings. And it doesn't present the best picture of who we are as human beings, what our desires and inclinations are, what we're capable of doing if left to ourselves. And these chapters are kind of a horror story of what we as human beings are capable of. And so God is in essence saying the response of punishment, of just saying, well, I'm going to curse, I'm going to flood, I'm going to scatter based on languages in the story of the Tower of Babel. These things might temporarily solve some problems, but they're not lasting. And so God's changing paths by saying, I'm now going to deal with the problem of the heart. The problem with human beings is not something that I can force them into, but they have to decide to change. We talked about how we still see that in ourselves today. You typically don't force somebody into something. For some people, when you try to force them into a way, it just makes them want to reject that way even more. I'm one of those people. Try to force me into something that I might have wanted to do in the first place. I'm no longer going to want to do it because now I'm being forced to do it. That's kind of the way that a lot of us are as human beings. And so God's like, I got to do something different. The cursing and the flooding is not going to solve the problem. We have to have a heart problem. But human beings have to be changed from the inside out to desire God, to desire righteousness, to desire the new creation. And that is what God begins with Abraham in chapter 12. So we have a foreshadowing of where the story is going to go with Abraham that ultimately gets us to Jesus. But before then, we have to finish the story of Noah. So, beginning in chapter 9. Yes?
You were talking about God destroying the earth. He did think about it. And who talked him out of it?
He thought about, with Noah, he thought about destroying the earth and then found Noah. And then you have, with Israel, he decided he was going to destroy Israel, right? Start again, and Moses talked him out of it. And then God, staying in Genesis, God almost got talked out of destroying Sodom and Gomorrah by Abraham, but they were so wicked that they had to be dealt with. So, if you look at God's relationship with humanity as a whole, and particularly, I think this is the sad part, his people in Israel, the story that it bears is God has a very difficult and stressful relationship with humanity, right? And we see this even when we get into chapter 9 of God's long-suffering with human beings, that he doesn't just give up. There are a number of times that we can think of that he wants to give up, but decides better of giving up on us. And ultimately, if we think future, not giving up on us to the point of giving up his son in order to save us, right? We think of the long suffering of God with us. And we see that when God desires to start again with Noah here in chapter 9, which begins like this. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And you be fruitful, multiply, abound on the earth, and multiply in it. God, one of the first things that God says to Noah and to his sons is he tells them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, which is, if you remember, is the same thing that God told Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 1. After God creates them in his image, which the image of God comes back up here as well. After God creates Adam and Eve in his image to be his royal representatives, to reflect God into the creation, he tells them what that looks like. What does it look like to be a royal representative of God the King? Well, you're fruitful and multiply, you fill the earth, and you rule over it. That's the job that God gives to Adam and Eve. After the flood, God repeats this to Noah, which signals to us that God is beginning again with Noah. Taking us back to Genesis 1 is to say that God is going to start this whole human creation thing over again with Noah and his family and the animals that were with him on the ark. Though, as we said, this doesn't last very long. It lasts a whopping 17 verses. And then it all goes downhill once again. But God is seeking to start again with Noah and his family. And I think this illustrates the point that we talked about of the long suffering of God. Because humanity is the reason for the flood. Like, God didn't just send it because he was bored one day. He sent it because we had become so evil and so violent, and both human beings and spiritual beings left the places that God had designated for them, that God's like, we have to do something about this. And the only thing, not necessarily the only thing, we don't know the mind of God, but it's as if the only thing God can come up with is, well, we have to just wipe them out and start over again. And Noah's the only one that I can find who is a good, righteous man that we can begin this earth project over with. And yet, God still wants them to be fruitful and multiply. Right? Humanity was responsible for the earth being covered in evil and violence and destroying God's creation. And yet, God not only doesn't destroy all of them, but starts over with Noah and his family, but doesn't want them, he doesn't tell them, okay, you just be a small little family, let's not get too many human beings because that just creates that many more problems. Every new human being we add to the equation, it's more problems we're adding to the equation. That's not what God does. Right? He says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then you notice that he repeats that in verse 7. He says, and you be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth, and multiply in it. God repeats himself like 10 times in these verses to be fruitful and multiply. He's not giving up on humanity. He wants them to continue to grow and spread throughout the creation. Now, I've got a question for you based on what we just read. If you remember when God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, what God says in Genesis 1 is a little bit different. There are a few differences between what he says in Genesis 1 and what God says to Noah here in Genesis chapter 9. Is there anything that sticks out to you that's different about what God says here in Genesis chapter 9 as opposed to what he said back in Genesis chapter 1? While you're looking, stay there in Genesis 9. I'm going to read what God says in Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, And they're going to, Adam and Eve are going to relate, Noah and his family, when they multiply upon the face of the earth, which takes us back to, this is the interesting of that language. So Adam and Eve are to be fruitful and multiply. And then the next time we see the word multiply, we're told that humanity has multiplied on the face of the earth, and then we're introduced to the evil that leads to the flood. And so we're kind of left to wonder, is multiplying a good thing? God says it, so we're like, yeah, but when we do it in practice, it's almost like in theory, yeah, it's a great thing.
Hey, it's just a reminder of the futility of mankind. That without God, we can multiply, we can have all of these technological gains, we can do all of these things and find cures for diseases, all these other things. But if we stray from God, ultimately we're lost. We're not going to have a flood that wipes us out. We're not going to have a Sodom and Gomorrah type event. I assume not, based on how the New Testament describes things. But that's the Bible's gentle reminder that the more that we multiply, the more that we put trust in ourselves, the more fruitless of the actual end result is for us.
We as human beings are capable of a lot of things. Most of them are not very good things. But we're capable of a lot of things. But I think, to your point, we very much overestimate ourselves. And you can see that. We're not going to dive into this, though it might be fun if we did. But if you look through the way that theology has developed and changed throughout the history of the church. So you go back to the beginning of the 2nd century, the books of the New Testament are written, and the church begins now to have to develop a theology, which is in essence to say, well, what are these saying about God? Like, how do we draw all of this together? And so you get beliefs about Jesus, and about the Trinity, and about sin, and about salvation. Something that's interesting when you look at the development of theology is that at some point, probably, having not studied this, I'm assuming it's probably around the Enlightenment, which is kind of thought of, we as human beings thinking that we've kind of rise to the pinnacle of what we are capable of doing on our own. It began to seep in and change the way that the church created theology, and a lot of theology starts becoming, you start getting theology that is works-based, which is why we needed the Protestant Reformation in the first place. That's one of the big things the Protestant Reformation pushed back against, is works-based salvation. You do these things, you try hard enough, you work hard enough, you pray enough that you can kind of solve all of your problems, and God kind of becomes your cheerleader, just helping you on. And honestly, that's the way that a lot of people still think about God and their relationship with God, and we overplay what we're able to do and just assume that, yeah, by my own strength, I can not do these things and do these good things and cause these good things to happen, and God just kind of needs to be there in the background in case I slip and fall and help me back up, and then I'll continue doing my own thing. Well, when we do that, we get Genesis 3 through 11, which is not the prettiest picture of us as human beings. But, okay, back to this command or this command/promise that God gives to Noah. Two of the big differences is first, in Genesis 1, Adam and Eve are to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth and subdue it. He said you are to have dominion, to rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every moving thing that moves on the face of the earth. Here in verse 2, this way the NRSV translates it, the fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and every bird of the air and everything that creeps on the ground and on all the fish of the sea. In Genesis 1, they are to rule over all the animals. In Genesis 9, the animal world is going to have fear so God's promise / command kind of begins taking a little bit of a darker turn. And there are a couple of ways that this can be interpreted. This is what I see going on here, is that rather than merely subduing and ruling over the creation will now fear humanity, which I think is hinting at the idea that humanity will no longer be the good stewards of the creation that God created and designed them to be. At the beginning, Adam and Eve were created to steward and care for the creation. They weren't to rule over it in a domineering fashion, but in that they were to care for it and to watch out for it and to protect it. But now, we're post-fall, God still has that desire, but it seems that there's a recognition that human beings are no longer going to be able to do it in the way that he intended. And that rather than human beings in the creation living in a harmony with one another, which is the imagery we get in Genesis 1, there's now going to kind of be this almost like pecking order within the creation. You're going to rule, but it's not going to be in quite the harmonious way that I desired, because a sin and evil, particularly going back to the end of chapter 8, the human heart has now entered the equation. And so there's going to be fear and dread that I think this is probably a reference back to the violence that led to the flood as well. That the violence human beings will cause against the animal world will mirror the violence they have caused among themselves, which led to the flood. In other words, if human beings left on their own are going to perpetuate violence against fellow human beings created in the image of God, how much more might we expect human beings left on their own to steward the creation to perpetuate violence among the created world as well? And so God recognizes, again, the inclination of the human heart that we as human beings are going to cause violence not just against ourselves, but also against the rest of the creation, which leads to fear and dread that the creation will have in regard to human beings, which these words, I think, anticipate what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. In Romans chapter 8, Paul says that the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. And I think there's a couple things that Paul means by that, but one of them is that the creation itself is waiting with eager longing for us to be transformed into the image bearers that God designed us to be. Because the relationship between us and the creation has moved from rule and steward the creation to fear and dread that the creation has, which means the creation is longing for us to be transformed to the people that God created and designed us to be, so that we steward the creation in the correct way. And so there's no longer fear and dread between us and the rest of the creation. There's now the harmonious ruling and stewarding among us in the creation that God intended. We see some images of this in other places in the Old Testament as well. In Isaiah, for example, when he talks about the new heavens and the new earth there, in Isaiah 65 and 66, you have language of like the wolf and the lamb lying together and kind of this harmony among the animal world. I'm not sure, though, that means that there weren't carnivorous animals before the fall, and just like, hey, we're going to go back where the wolf and lamb actually lie together and there's not a predator and prey. Not sure that's the idea. It's likely more metaphorical of there's going to be this harmony within the creation. And what that looks like, we don't know. Partly because we only know the creation is the way that it is now. And we know, yeah, there are these certain relationships that are kind of built into the created world, like predator and prey, but the idea is all of this gets transformed into a more harmonious world, something different than what we live in now, that we don't fully understand what that looks like. But it's not just, and this was when we did our series on new creation, thinking about heaven as the language of Scripture as new heavens and a new earth, that the harmony that God desires is not merely harmony between us, but it's harmony among the entirety of creation, where God can dwell with the entirety of creation as he did.
In
Back in
Genesis, you see the creativity of God. And then in chapter 9, where we're talking about here, you see that anger and destruction that God showed people to try to get them back in line. Not necessarily that, I mean, he destroyed all but Noah and his family. But then, from that on, the recording of that on, people had something to look back at, to realize that if you didn't follow God the way he wanted you to, that there would be destruction again.
Which we see time and time again, particularly in the Old Testament, right? We see examples of that, and that allows Genesis 1 through 11 then to be kind of a cautionary tale, as we've talked about, of human nature in a lot of ways. Real quickly, in our last few minutes, the second primary difference is that in Genesis 1, humanity was only given plants to eat, and their food source here in the promises of Genesis 9 extends to the animal world. So verse 3, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you green plants, referring back to Genesis 1, I give you everything, only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it. From human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. So, the food source for human beings is extended from plants to animals. Now, does that mean that all human beings prior to this point were vegetarians? I would say probably not, but I'm going to leave that up to you to answer for yourself. Because the point of what is said here is not so much for us to dive into the historical diet of Homo sapiens upon the earth. The point here is to emphasize the significance of blood and life and the way that we treat and interact with the life of God's creation is the point. So we can believe whatever we want about human diet. Not the primary point of what's going on here. We talked about last week how everything that lives, that has blood flowing through its veins, going back to Genesis 1, God breathed the breath of life. So human beings don't just have the breath of life. Every living thing, everything that breathes has the breath of life. So when God sends the flood, he destroys everything that had the breath of life, human beings and animals alike. Everything with the breath of life is destroyed. But in the Old Testament, the breath of life is connected, we talked about, to the idea of soul, that both in the Old Testament word nephesh, that's sometimes translated soul, is used for both human beings and animals as well, and it refers to the entire being. So us as human beings, it refers to our body and to our mind and to our spirit, are all encapsulated in this idea of soul. You are a soul, according to the Old Testament, not because you have some part of you that inhabits a physical body, but because you are made up of body and of mind and of spirit. But that's also connected to the idea of blood, because ancient people figured out, not that this was that hard, if you don't have blood, you don't have life. If you lose enough blood, you lose your life. So the blood of both human beings and animals is connected to the soul and is connected to the breath of God. All of these ideas are connected. Soul is sometimes translated as life as well. So this idea of soul or life is connected on the one hand to God's breath, and on the other hand to blood, which our bodies, in which God has breathed his breath to give us that life at the very
Do you
beginning.
think that, opening up the animal, to human beings, to eat, do you think that's related to the reason that God put all those animals on the ark?
I think the primary reason that God put the animals on the ark is because of the care that God has for the entire creation. That the ark is meant to be a mini Garden of Eden, with all of God's creations dwelling in it, and through which God starts again. I think the opening up and the speaking of opening up animals as food for human beings, I think that illustrates primarily a way that God desires for Israel in particular, because remember, these are Israel's scriptures written by Israelites for Israelites. So particularly for Israel, a way that God wants them to think about life, not just human life, but also animal life. To me, this is what I think that's going on here. I think, and I say I think, because you could argue against this, but in my reading of both Old Testament and New Testament, the taking of life from anything that has the breath of life, or that has blood running through its veins, because those ideas are connected. So anything with the breath of life or with blood, taking that life is something that is sacred and is reserved only for God. God, as the creator, as the giver of breath, as the giver of life, is the only one that has the ability to take life. But what we see, particularly in the Old Testament, is that there are times when God gives this right to human beings who are created in his image. So you think of that image being a royal representative. So God's the king, and there are certain rights that only the king has, certain things that only the king can do. But the king can give those rights to certain people that work for him, right? So he can send a servant to go and do something on his behalf. An example of that would be a king might send a servant or a representative to another king to make peace. And in that situation, the opposing king is to treat that servant or that representative as if they are the actual king. Because in that moment, they have been given the power and the authority to bring about peace on behalf of the king. And I think what we see here is something similar, that taking the life of anything that has the breath of life in it is something that's sacred and is reserved for God, but at times, God gives humanity this right as his image bearers. And in this case, he gives them the right to take the life of other animals for the purpose of food. But you have this one stipulation, right? You can't eat the animal with its blood, because its blood is its life. And I think the reason behind that is not that there is anything inherently morally wrong with doing otherwise. I think the reason God does this is to emphasize the sanctity of life. In essence, to say, I'm giving you the ability to take the life of animals for food. Don't abuse it or take that lightly. Don't think that it's okay for you just to go and destroy my animal world that I have created just because I've given you this right. And every time they have to take the life, the blood out of it, you think about, not to be gruesome, but you think about draining an animal of its blood. For an Israelite, what they're meant to see is literally the life that God has given to this animal bleeding out from it. And there's something sacred there. There's something that they're not to take lightly there about what they're doing, though God has given them the ability to do that. That, I think, is why God expands that to human beings. And he's like, okay, so taking the life of an animal is sacred, not something to be taken lightly, and the blood is the reminder of that. But human beings are on another level because they're created in the image of God. The animal world might have the breath of God in them that gives them life. They are not created in the image of God. And the way you interact with an image bearer of God is different. That is something that is more sacred, which is why God says that there will be a penalty for taking the life of a human being. For both, interestingly, animals and human beings. If an animal takes a human life, there's a penalty. If human beings take a human life, there's a penalty.
It's amazing to me how God teaches us from the creation throughout the Old Testament into the New Testament, and guess what? The only thing we see that's perfect in everything is Christ. The only thing that's going to save us is His blood. All of this is all coming through the Scriptures throughout the Old Testament. It's just teaching us what we are going to experience, what humanity is going to experience through His Son.
Yeah, so you think about the importance that's placed on blood here, particularly on the shedding of human blood, and that both animals and human beings their life will be required for taking the life of a human being. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next week, but I think that's likely speaking of the stipulations in the law, because remember, these stories are being written after Israel has the law. And so according to their law, a farm animal mauls another human being, you kill the animal for it. A human being kills another human being. Sometimes you require the life of a human being. Now, that's a whole big thing that we could get into on what's considered a human being and levels of human beings, because the problem is in the ancient world, men were full human beings, but everybody else was different levels of partial human being, which might be a discussion for, definitely not today, but might be a discussion for another study that we do. But it's likely reflecting that idea of the law. But what's interesting is a couple of things, and I'll leave you with this, and we'll talk about it more next week, that it's a bit ironic that God says that He's going to require human life for human life, given the story of Cain in Genesis 4. Because that's not what God did. God spared Cain and protected Cain with the mark when He sent him out into the world. The other thing, that's looking backward. As Tom said, when we look forward and we think about Jesus, the shedding of Jesus' innocent blood for the salvation of us, and you think about that in the terms of Genesis, of we are people that risk violently shedding blood for no reason, human blood and animal blood. That's the inclination of our hearts. And to solve that, God sent His Son, to whom that's what we did. That's what humanity did, what we've always been doing. But by doing that, God finds a way to begin to change the human heart, which is the whole thing that God promises that He's going to do after the flood. I'm over time, not that that's unusual. We will pick up there and talk a little bit about some of these things some more next week, and then we'll make our way through